In this video, I will show you how I achieved a wide range of colors using Pokeberry and a few modifications to the dye bath. The entire process took me about 2 days, but that's because I let the wool soak overnight in a cold bath. You could do this in one day if you started early. Working with natural dyes is a lot easier than it looks. There are a lot of plants that you can use to create natural dyes, so if there's something growing in your area that's relatively abundant and not rare, you may want to try this at home. Hi, this is Elizabeth from Botanical. Today I'm going to show you how I dye wool with pokeberry. If you live in North America, you might be familiar with the native plant pokeberry. Pokeberry has these dark purple berries that will stain your fingers fuchsia, almost the same color as the stem. The seeds and the fruits are poisonous. I'm going to use pokeberry today to dye wool. I have 2 skeins of white merino. Usually when you're dyeing wool, you need to use a mordant. A mordant is something that helps the color stick to the wool and prevents it from washing out easily. So although you don't need to use a mordant with certain vegetable dyes, including pokeberry, this is wool that I had previously mordanted in alum. When the fiber is laying in the dye pot, you want it to be loose and open like this, rather than in a tight ball, so it absorbs the color more evenly and you don't get that tie-dyed or maybe speckled effects where something is touching and crumpled up together. In order to prevent the fibers from getting tangled while they're laying in the dye pot, I have these little loops, I have these small loops of wool that hold the fiber in place. When I'm finished dyeing and I've let the yarn dry fully, then I can wind it into a ball like this. Earlier this year, I co-hosted a workshop with the New Jersey Mycological Association where we dyed wool with fungi. And since I already had all the dye pots out and plenty of wool mordanted, I decided to use some of the marigolds that I collected from my garden earlier that spring to dye some wool. And between the mushrooms and the marigolds, I ended up with a lot of yellow yarn. This really bright shade is from the marigolds. This more golden shade of yellow was from Dyer's Polypore, and it was sort of the end of the dye bath. But if you're ever dyeing wool and you don't like the color, as long as it's still light, you can save the wool and over dye it. So to over dye this wool, I first need to unwind it and open it up into a hank like this. Tie the ends together so it's free, and I can just add it to the dye pot with everything else. I'm hoping that when I over dye this wool with the fuchsia from the pokeberry, I'm going to get a more warm orangey color. But we'll see what happens. Pokeberries have a very intense pigment, so when you're handling them, you should wear gloves, and you may also want to do this outside so you don't stain any surfaces like your countertops. If you are under the age of 18, please do this with parental supervision, and don't let any pets or animals near the dye pot or the plant. Some dyes are really sensitive to subtle changes in pH, so if you're working with a different natural dye, you might want to be careful about your water source. I know that my water here is acidic, so I will have a lower pH than most people or someone who used filtered water. I think working with an electric burner is a little bit safer, and you also don't run the risk of running out of propane or gas. Pokeberries are poisonous, so it's better to work with them outside where you have access to fresh air and you're not directly inhaling any fumes. Most people who dye with pokeberry like to add some vinegar to the pre-soaking bath. Vinegar will soften the yarn and it may also help improve the color. You want to make sure that the water is warm to the touch but not boiling. Just adding a little bit of vinegar. Never use boiling water with wool because it will damage the fibers. And you also want to be careful with how much you handle the wool, because if you were to pat down too much, you would felt the wool and it would lose its nice soft texture. So I'm just pressing down enough to submerge it. So let's see how the dye bath looks. I'm still waiting for the dye bath temperature to go up, but I have my wool soaking here and it looks like it's almost ready to go in the dye bath. If you've ever tried to use natural dyes before, then you know that this process can sometimes take all day. It's always exciting to see what colors you can get from weeds that you find in your yard. And it's just one more way that you can get to know the native plants in your area. You may have a lot of weeds in your yard that you consider invasive and they tend to come back no matter how many times you pull them. But these plants may have medicinal values, or they may have been used as natural dyes in the past. So it's starting to get dark outside, but I'm still waiting for the dye bath to get a little bit hotter. And I have a colander here, so when it's ready, I can just lift and all the pokeberries will be removed. It would be a good idea to have some utensils so I could break up the pokeberries a little bit more. All I have today is just my thermometer. Just gonna give them a good squish. There's definitely a lot of color starting to develop. I'm going to start with the yellow. So just squeeze. It's nice and warm. Another thing I forgot to mention, if you're working with undyed wool for the first time, you should always scour it. So for that, you can just use Dawn dish soap. So if I only wanted a light pink, I could take this out now, just squeeze it gently, and rinse it out, and I would be left with this light color, which actually, this is very pretty, but this is when I remembered that I still needed to strain out the pokeberries. I'm going to take my wool out of the pot and I'm going to transfer the extra dye. Let's see if we can get this out. It's already orange. So that's out. It's starting to boil nicely. It's almost more fun doing this in the dark. When it was too dark outside to continue working, I turned the electric burner off and moved the dye pot into the shed. I left the wool in the dye pot where it could soak overnight. Without heat, it does take longer for the wool to absorb the color. The next day, I started to rinse the wool off with water and some vinegar. The pink hues were much lighter than I thought they would be. I think that I let the dye pot get too hot at one point because it seemed like some of the yellow from the marigold dyed wool spread to the new undyed wool. I also wanted darker colors, so I soaked the yarn again in a higher concentration of vinegar before adding it back to the dye pot. new results were much better, and I really liked the variation between each skein. As you can see here, small changes like adding more vinegar or allowing the wool to soak longer make all the difference. It was fun experimenting with this batch of pokeberry dye, and now I have enough wool for a small project. It's really not that difficult to work with natural dyes. It just takes quite a bit of time. I hope you enjoyed my experiment with pokeberry, and thanks for watching.